Hello, I'm Frank Epstein, founder and president of Collage New Music. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our latest online presentation entitled The Composer Speaks. The Composer Speaks is an opportunity to introduce composers directly to you. Our guest today is John Harbison. A Pulitzer Prize winning composer, John makes his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's a professor of composition and chamber music at Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Department of Music. Collage has performed John's music for many years and received a Grammy nomination for our recording of his epic song cycle, Mottetti di Montale. The Boston Symphony commissioned and premiered John's first, fifth, and sixth symphonies. John is a wonderful composer and so supportive of his younger colleagues, including composers, vocalists, and instrumentalists. John will be interviewed by music director David Hoose. We thank you all for joining us, and we hope this experience will bring you closer to new music and the composers who write it.
This is my little workroom actually rather palatial workroom in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Where you do most of your work? Do you do your composing and your score study there?
Pretty
practicing
much.
the viola?
Practicing the piano really, actually, yeah, my work on my Bach Art of the Fugue.
Do you find yourself playing the piano more now that things are very isolated for everyone?
I think so. I'm trying to also stay in shape because if we come out of this, I've got my my group at MIT, SIN, Strength in Numbers, has a couple of gigs coming up. And I find that the daily Bach is probably very helpful.
Practicing the art of the fugue is what keeps you in shape for your jazz group.
That's my fantasy of the thing, yes. It also, I just find that fascination of how each piece is getting harder in that sequence. It's almost a fantasy that you get a finger on each note, even around number 6. But they are keyboard pieces, and I think it's important to keep believing that.
Do you have a feeling that Bach had to practice his own music? Or do you think his facility was so great that, in fact, the music he was writing just fit under his fingers?
I think his facility was already legendary, and certainly he expects a tremendous amount of unusual things to happen under the hands. But I think that's one of the wonderful things about those pieces. They don't act like piano music, but they turn out to be realizable, which I think is a fascinating puzzle.
A fellow musician, friend of both of ours, said to me that she was practicing Bach as well. And the thing she liked about Bach was that you could play it at any speed.
True, and that makes the early work on something like the Art of the Fugues very satisfying, because at any speed you feel they're making plenty of sense. And if you never got any faster, you'd be fine.
You ordinarily lead a very busy life, obviously composing, but teaching, conducting, playing the viola, playing piano in your jazz group. And also you spend a good bit of your time, it seems to me, because I see you there, going to concerts. So some of those activities, not your piano playing so much, but some of those activities are stolen from us right now, which we hope is only momentary. So I'm wondering how this shutdown, as it were, has touched your composing activity, if at all. Has it just given you more time, or less inspiration, or in what way has it affected what you're doing?
I think it seems, I've talked to a lot of people about their experiences. It seems similar to mine, that you lose more time when there is more available time. That's, I think, the puzzling part. I think overall I get about the same amount accomplished as if there were no COVID. But there is a lot of space that seems to get away, and I'm not quite sure where it goes. Though some of it goes into interesting pursuits. I've found I'm quite nimble about dropping everything to listen to more things. Someone mentioned to me that Kurtag's opera was on YouTube, and I thought, well, sure, okay. And I got out the English language version of Endgame and followed it along quite well on the YouTube. 2.5 hours later, I'd heard the piece. And I'm not sure I was, and under normal circumstances, with a lot of regular teaching and so forth, I'm not sure I would do that. I also got a tip on a very distinguished performance of Winterreise, which was going on in music from Marlborough with Mark Patmore and Mitsuko Ushida. And not having really listened to that piece or thought about it since I coached it with 2 mathematicians at MIT about 3 years ago, I decided it was time for another Winterreise. And an hour and a half later, I had made it through that piece. Goodness knows how we ever do get through it. And I think that's a mark of feeling like, okay, if something big comes up, you can do it. You do have time.
I can't help asking what it was like coaching 2 mathematicians in that great song cycle.
It was a wonderful experience. They were both musicians I had worked with on numerous other things, actually. The baritone in vocal ensemble and the pianist in lots of standard chamber music. So I trusted them as hardworking musicians, and they had prepared all summer. And they said, okay, now we're ready. Give us a couple sessions and we'll perform the piece. And I had one session and I said, no, we're actually going to spend quite a lot of time. And we did about 2 songs a week for the rest of that year. And the performance was postponed, I think, about 7 months. But it was wonderful.
Were they happy with that?
I think at first they were a little stymied and puzzled, but eventually, yes, I think they bought into the idea that, in fact, this piece takes more than a lifetime. And it was a good experience, I think, for all of us. It's quite a lot for 2 musicians who are not professionally headed to be musicians, and who are both in some field of algebra where they go to conferences where there's only them and 7 other people who understand what they're doing. So there's a meeting of minds there to start with, which I think is good. But that they have the kind of enterprise, as I've known for years, to invest tremendously in a really quite impassioned way in projects like this. It's nice to feel that the music has so much hold that something which has no professional centrality to them still will absorb a huge amount of their energy, which of course it certainly did.
What turned out to be the major issues that you thought needed to be addressed in that working period of 7 months?
The same issue that seems always to be the primary issue in every music that I coach with anyone: pulse, steadiness of rhythmic impulse, and the power of commitment to pulse in the support of songs as beautifully built as those songs.
So I assume that you're saying that doesn't mean that the idea of rubato is an anathema, but rather something more sophisticated.
Oh yeah, no, but that there is a tempo which is appropriate to the character and the words, which is operable and relevant through the piece, regardless of what expressive inflections are taken. And that seemed to me, as I started work with them, the element that we'd have to spend the most time convincing ourselves about.
I presume, like any human being, you get stuck at times, feel like, I don't know what to do here. I don't know where to turn. This material's not working for me. It's not playing out in a way I hoped, or I don't know how to deal with this material, for the moment anyway. And I'm wondering how you get unstuck, if you do get stuck, and also whether you think in some way that your very broad knowledge of vast amounts of repertoire out there somehow open doors for you.
Yeah, I think being stuck is someplace that I spend a lot of time, and I have a lot of, after many years, quite a few strategies. Sometimes the best thing to do is to leave the spot and really walk away from it for a while. And then sometimes I wind up treating it very provisionally and arbitrarily and just writing a lot of next steps, which is partly a way of seeing what not to do. But eventually, I think usually I wind up doing that thing, which I think it happens at some point in every piece, of leaving the thing I can't solve until the very last problem in the piece. That is that painful problem will remain unsolved until it just becomes a crux. Like, this piece will never be unless I can do something here. And sometimes the thing I do is never quite right, but often it will be repaired later if necessary. I had a spot like that in my Fifth Symphony where I came to a place where I felt like this would be a big orchestral tutti. There already had been a couple big ones in that piece. And I wrote one and I thought, well, I finally faced up to it. And then just before I sent the piece out, as I was making the piano score of the piece, I thought, oh my gosh, this sounds very manufactured. And I replaced a passage with probably about 4,000 notes with 3 chords. Which had not occurred to me.
Very beautifully chosen chords.
Yeah, well,
yes.
Let me say they were very welcome chords, because not a solution I'd thought of at the point that I'd first become stuck. I thought that being unstuck meant stepping up and just really powering it, taking it to the ground. Instead, it was a more scorched earth kind of thing, and I really felt like that for once, that strategy of leaving it to the end was worth it, waiting for a better solution.
So, John, when you got stuck at that moment in the Fifth Symphony, was it a technical problem or one of inspiration, or are those things inseparable for you?
I think it was a place that I knew I was working with a text and was working with a sort of story, and it seemed like such a crucial point in the story that I was trying to raise the bar. I was trying to say something exceptional needs to happen here. And already in a way that may not have been a helpful approach, I probably needed to find some way more organically, which eventually is what happened. And some way that also thinking more theatrically, that is, how could it happen more concisely, which it really didn't occur to me at first. So I think it was probably much more that thing of drawing out of the piece and going out of the inner ear. Well, the inner ear always has lots of inner things to say, you know, for just the 5 people who might understand them. And back into the outer ear, which is the person who is listening just for the immediate impression of where they are in the piece. And I think that was what was necessary. It's one of the things that in teaching is easy to say to young composers because they're so far into the inner ear that your whole task is to try to pull them out and say, hey, people are also listening to this, that don't know where it's going and are living it as it happens. So I think that's what that whole problem was about.
A lot of the pieces that you have composed are sacred works. And I'm wondering if you hear or perceive a difference between those works and, say, your purely orchestral works or chamber pieces. The presence of a text aside, when you listen to the music or the thinking process, do you think that they distinguish themselves? If, for instance, if someone were to listen to a sacred piece of yours and a so-called secular piece of yours, minus the words, would someone perceive a difference?
Well, I like that question because I do feel that clearly the impulse, the guiding spirit of music is not secular. It is mysterious and sort of not from this world as we know it. But that said, I do love things about the premise of sacred music. And I've written a lot of music for you. In fact, thank heavens, I've had a chance to write this kind of music, both for manual for cantata singers in situations where the group and the audience are ready to listen in what I take as a way that one listens to this music. The thing I like about sacred music, one of the things, and I try to sort of mention it sometimes to certain of my colleagues in this very positive way, is that it doesn't require an audible or demonstrative stance from the listener. You don't applaud at the end of a Bach cantata normally. You don't have to applaud a sacred motet. You can think what you think. You can receive it in the way that you receive it. And I love moving it in that way to a somewhat different arena. I've gotten so, let's just say suspicious of the standing O, and of course, even more of what we would call the crouching ovation, which is that in so many cases now become, if you don't offer the standing ovation, it's a deep insult to the performers, you know. All of this in sacred music, in principle, is not a factor. It's because the audience is not us. It is us, but it's not ultimately us. And that's one of the reasons that I've felt very privileged to be able to continue working in that catalog, because uh, I feel like the effort uh, and the invited listeners are in a different frame of mind. And that's a frame of mind I really love to find myself in and find listeners in. That is to say, it's more contemplative, it's less judgmental, it's more willing to accept non-logical premises, premises requiring a leap of some kind into something that we can't explain. And that's why I guess probably when you come down to it, my favorite music in the world is in some way in that realm, including some works by Beethoven, composers, who are not by general profession composers of sacred music. I mean, a Schütz motet is speaking to listeners in another way from a Shostakovich symphony. Not to say that Shostakovich is without his own spiritual concerns, but the Schütz motet is not asking for a certain of endorsement from the hearer.
You are very much in demand and have been for many, many years with commissions. Sometimes you've told me that there's too much music to write and that it's pressing on you in some way. But I'm wondering, but I also have the thought that you find time to compose pieces that no one is asking for, that you do simply for your own enjoyment and edification. And I'm wondering how that balances out in your life.
Seems to have always been a balance. I am always surprised to see how much work I've done all the way through that it was not commissioned. There were just pieces that I had decided to do. And a lot of big pieces, the piece, hour-long piece, Mottetti di Montale, which I wrote as a volunteer song cycle, which is a wonderful piece you've done wonderful performances of in the instrumental version. That was when that got that big, I began thinking, wow, this is a lot of a lot of music to try to convince somebody to perform. And I got a couple really good breaks on that with people saying, okay, well, we'll do it. But that's always the risk. And lately I've been doing much more of that kind of work. I haven't had as many commissions, but I've had a lot of things that I've been thinking about doing. And one of them being this thing that I've been constantly putting off, which is I don't write easily for piano. It's always the hardest thing for me. And I've always thought I need to do it more to feel less daunted by it, less buffaloed by the prospect. And that's sort of what I'm trying to do now. I'm trying to feel more that it's a friendlier world, which means letting go of the virtuosic side.
Is that what you are focusing on now? Or I'm wondering, do you work on more than one piece at once?
Yeah, I've wanted to keep projects going because for when you get stuck, it's good to have another piece to move on to. And I've usually tried to keep that option going. So I have a couple other things. I've got some jazz projects. I've been trying to write a big band piece for 2 or 3 years, and it just isn't coming out very well. But I'm now thinking of trying to salvage whatever in it that did work. I write a lot of pop tunes. Lately, they've been quite abundant, and I've been thinking about what I want to do with them. And then I also have a kind of nice relationship. I hope it continues nice, though the getting the rights has been a terrific problem, with a poet, Louise Glick. I've written quite a bit of music now on her texts, and I have a new cycle, which I've been trying to get clear the use of the poems. I have a few more poems of hers that I have in mind. I really tend to stay with a writer for a while until I feel like I've got a grip. And I'm just getting that with her poetry. And I guess that something more will go in that direction. I also really continue to write these solo violin pieces. Anytime someone writes me, wants a kind of honorific piece or something to celebrate an anniversary, something, I've been writing a solo violin piece. And it's now turned into a collection of about 6, and I have another collection coming along. And that seems to be a nice, it's almost like a diary collection. I did it years ago with some solo viola pieces, just some way to keep the thoughts running. And one of the things I miss doing is large ensemble music. I miss it only in principle because it's hard work. But I'm sort of keeping an eye out for maybe one more shot on some sort of a shorter orchestra piece. There's something about the orchestral music I've been hearing sometimes from the younger composers around that makes me think about the orchestra in a somewhat different way. It's never been my home, the large orchestra, but I look around and I think, well, I must have spent quite a lot of time there. I got these big, thick scores sitting around. I think I'm not done with it. I think I've got something left there. Maybe a tuba concerto, because that was my best instrument when I was in high school. I think I owe the tuba some thought.
Well, that they would have something besides the Vaughan Williams concerto.
There isn't so much for tuba, and it's a composer-friendly concerto instrument because you'll hear it. And having written a viola concerto, and I've written cello, not so easy to be heard.
Right.
I remember Lucas Foss gave me some unsolicited advice once on a cello concerto. He says, I said, I heard you writing a cello concerto. He says, maybe a little harp. that was the only safe thing he could offer to me.
That's right. So, yeah. John, this is maybe too large a question. I don't know, but do you at this moment have an idea of how someone might describe the arch of your compositional life up to this point, from your years at Princeton studying with Roger Sessions, kinds of changes in your musical thinking? Are you able to assess that, or is that just something that we have to do?
I think the only formation for sort of that kind of thinking that I've ever been able to shape is that when I was a kid growing up, I listened to the opera on the weekends, and I, imagined how they looked, and I subscribed to the opera news, and so I was a real opera guy, and I learned how a lot of operas went, and I thought, this is what I want to do. I'm going to spend my entire life writing opera. And then I kind of started on my life, and I wrote a volunteer opera, no commission, just wrote it. And I have to admit, it's a pretty naughty piece, but it also has some stage value. And the piece was tried out quite well. And I met a big, let's say, an entity, a powerful entity, and let's call it the opera world, mm-hmm. which is different from the art of opera, and always has been. And I've found that opportunities and further activity in that field that I always planned to be my major were not going to come easily. And so, and it has been for lack of shall we say, putting out the lines. So as it is, I've written only a short opera and two longer operas. Instead of what I expected to be able to say at this point is that at the end of my 12th opera, I feel like I did exactly what I imagined doing when I was a kid. And
Verdi.
Right, that was what I thought. This was what I thought I'm really best cut out for. So clearly, the shape of the ambition and the shape of the world were not contiguous. And that feels like a regret in a certain way, and feels like the bumpiest rides I've had in terms of writing a piece and then trying to get it out into the world have been having to do with opera from the very start. And all I can say is I honor maybe the people who persisted in that world are of tougher skin and hardier constitution and more persistent mentality than I. And whatever regrets I have are all focused around that sort of chimerical, the ship that sailed past. I don't regret, I'd have to say composing the three operas was the most congenial I ever felt about any project. In all those cases, I felt, gee, I really know what I'm doing for once, I really think I see how to do this. I've never otherwise had that feeling. On the other hand, that has not been what I felt was coming back from the profession. And I think it all came to a head sitting in a very heavily staged extra rehearsal at the Chicago Lyric when the members of the company were deciding whether or not to eliminate the final scene of The Great Gatsby.
If there were ever a composer whom I knew who I thought of as clear-minded and authoritative in his music, it would be you. I would recount a tiny story that you wouldn't remember. Many years ago, after you had written your first symphony, you kindly sent me a score. And this is a work I've conducted a few times since then, but I was looking at it and I had heard the first performance as well. And I was looking at it and there was this place somewhere fairly early in the piece where the trombone played a B flat. And I remember having the audacity to say to you, John, I think that B flat's too soon. I think it needs to come, maybe not right there, but 2 beats later or something like that. I don't know what it was, I said. And you very kindly said, okay. And when I looked at the score, as I have when it was printed and have used it to study this work, I looked at that moment and that B flat is still there, as it probably should be. So the opera world, if they're rearranging the Queen of Spades of Tchaikovsky or talking about removing the last scene from The Great Gatsby, that's a different level of involvement than my saying, maybe not so soon on the B flat.
Oh yeah. It is another realm and probably should be. On the other hand, it's business, and it's the need to reach a public which is incredibly vocal. David, I was riding a bus, I think it was 10 years or 8 years after the Gatsby performances in New York. And a guy came up to me and he said, it would be so much better if you hadn't put Wolfsheim on stage at the end of that act, that he comes out and scares everybody. And, it's just a really big dramatic mistake. We don't ever want to have to see them on stage together like that. It's really, that'd be much better opera if you just hadn't done that. I've never met this guy. I never had a conversation with him. There's a passionate discussion on his part. And I remember thinking, wow, that's right. I mean, experiences like that have continued ever since, and very few people relative to the population saw that piece, but amazing people. So many people have had so many comments years later. That's both weird and a great virtue of probably the opera public, is nobody ever comes up to you after a string quartet, as you know, David, or a symphonic work, and says, if only you had, if only you'd left out the coda of the slow movement.
That G-sharp's terrible.
Just get rid of that, and you got a hit, It's another mentality, and I guess we should be grateful for it, but it is truly a world. And it's why the opera public is so distinct to that medium. I think there are people whose only musical passion is that, and I get that. I guess because they own it, Yeah, they really do.
So, does your Chicago Lyric Opera story have a happy ending? I don't mean the opera have a happy ending. We know it doesn't, but.
Yeah, and in fact, they kept the scene mainly because the cast liked singing it. I've had, that scene has followed me around. Somebody came up to me during the second run at the Met and said, that I just hated your last scene so much, it just turned me against the whole piece, and I didn't like the opera much, but the scene, that last scene just really, I said, I hated it so much. This was right after a performance. I had to buy another ticket and come back to see it again, because something was haunting. I kept seeing the scene and the guys in the rain hats, and the rain was coming down and carrying the coffin. It was haunting to me. So I thought I'd better come back and see it. I'd better see it. So I was very interested. I said, yeah, well, you did wonderful. I'm so glad you did. What did you think? He says, I still hated it. I still hated it. Yeah, but it's really interesting being in an audience. Did you hear the time with the premiere first performance of my brass concerto? And the guy comes down and sits next to me. I've got this aisle seat, so I can go run backstage in the LA, in the old LA place, in the music hall.
Yeah.
And he says, "I'm sorry, he says, I would like that seat of yours, because if I've been told that this first piece will be quite unpleasant, and if necessary, I would like to be able to leave easily." So I said, well, okay, what am I to say? I have one seat over. I'll just go and put him in the aisle seat. So he took the seat, and we listened to the piece.
Yeah. Your piece, yeah.
Yeah, and we get to about halfway through the last moon, which is where they told me to head for the door so I could get backstage to go on stage. So at that point, I crawled over the guy. I said to him, I can't take it anymore myself. And then I went on stage, and of course I wasn't very far from him. And he was still sitting in the aisle seat. He had kind of a grin on his face. He kind of got it, but it was too perfect. It was like, it was like one of those all-time perfect setups.
John, for me, and I think many people who will watch this has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm grateful to you for taking your time out of your composing and your practicing art of fugue, which we'll let you get back to. Thank you so much, John Harbison. It's great to see you. As always, it's a great pleasure to talk with you. Mottetti di Montale was a work he wrote originally for voice and piano. It's an hour-long work in 4 large sections. Over the years, he orchestrated the piece for an ensemble of 10, 11 instruments, and Collage New Music did the first complete performance of the whole cycle, and we ended up recording it with 2 different singers and the ensemble. And I think to get to hear even 1 or 2 movements of this very intense, beautiful cycle of poems by Eugenio Montale will be a great treat, a great blessing.
Nella polvere del pesto un ronzino